In this lesson, we will learn how to create and modify keyframes on Maya's time slider. So in this scene, we have the final airship rig. If you hadn't followed along in the previous section where we've rigged the airship, I'd like to show you just a few of the cool features we've added. So we've added some turbine control to adjust the thrusters at the back. We'll be using this in the final animation. We also have automated the turbine fans to spin. Then we have an attribute here to control their speed. So this goes up to about a value of 5. You can go ahead and test that out, hitting play. So really cool stuff here. I'll go ahead and set this back to 0. You'll see that when it is set to 0, there's going to be no movement at all. Or to go ahead and drag on the time slider here. So again, just added some cool features here that we will use when animating the ship as it undocks from the fueling depot. And speaking of which, if I were to head over to the display layers, notice we have one layer that is currently hidden. I'll click on this first box to show you. So we have our platform, then we have this fueling line. If we were to select our ship control and go to our move tool, you could see that we could actually start to have that fueling line to form. But it's not time for that yet, so let's go ahead and hide that layer. I just wanted to go ahead and show you what was in the scene. Now, just to kind of preface this, in the next few lessons we'll be learning some very critical animation tools and tips. However, that doesn't necessarily relate to our final animation, so we're going to deviate slightly, but still pay attention to the tools we'll use because you'll be using them throughout your animation process. Alright, so with that said, we'll bring our attention down to the time slider just to get more familiar with this. So as we left click and drag, we can scrub through animation. This is in a way considered flip booking, where we can just kind of test our gestures and our timing. And then underneath that we have our range slider, so that will help us to just focus on a specific range. So let's say if our entire range here was 1 and 100, what we currently have, but we only wanted to focus on, let's say, 1 to 38. Well, we can adjust this end bar here to frame 38, and that's what we'll see in our viewport. And notice we have these fields here to adjust the frame range to get the exact range we need. So if we wanted to, let's say, go to a range of 1 and 34, we can go ahead and use that as our playback end range. How about 5 and 34? Well, then we'd go to this second field here. Now the last few fields, they adjust our full range. So if we were to double click, you'll see that we're able to jump back to that full range. If we double click again, we revert back to where we were before. So it's a great way to, again, just jump back and forth. We also can come up to our current time field and go to a specific frame. So if we wanted to, we can go to frame 40 by typing that in. Alright, so to the right of this, what we find are basically tools that are very similar to what we'd see on a remote. So the first icon will jump to the very beginning of our range, again set by the first field. Or if we'd like to go frame by frame backwards, we can use the next icon. If we had any keyframes, we would use the following icon to jump to the previous keyframe. Then if you like to play your animation in reverse, you can go ahead and use the next icon. Believe it or not, this is a great way to double check and make sure your animation is looking correct. They say if it looks good in reverse, it looks good forward. And speaking of which, the next tool here will allow us to play the animation forward. We click again and it'll stop. Then we know what the next few icons do for jumping to the next key or to the next frame or to the very end of the animation defined by this time field here. Okay, great. So now that we're familiar with the playback controls and the time slider, let's go ahead and start adding some animation. So there are a set of rules that we'll want to keep in mind when animating. You'd first want to adjust your time. So go to the frame you'd like to record a keyframe at. And just for this demonstration, I'm just going to go ahead and set this to frame 32, let's say. And then afterwards, you would adjust your object. So in our case, let's go ahead and translate our ship down. And then once we find a position we like, we're ready to record the keyframe. We have a few ways to do that. We could either use the S key. We can see by default, that's going to give us far more keys than we need. We're only editing the y-axis, so chances are that's the only keyframe we'll need at this point. But with that being said, S is great for locking down all of your attributes. That way, none of your gestures are lost. I typically like to use the S key when working with character sets, and if you'd like to learn more about that, feel free to take a look at our character interaction in Maya course, or even Introduction to Animation. Alright, so let's say if we wanted to remove this keyframe. Let's say we've added too many, we just want to go ahead and remove some. Well, we can go ahead and right click on the key and choose delete. That's one way. It'll clear up all of those attributes. Or if I were to press Z to undo that, we can go to the channels we'd like to remove animation from. So I'm just control clicking a few of these. And then we can right click and choose break connections. So that's another way. But what I'm going to do is actually remove the entire animation here on frame 32 by just right clicking and choosing delete, because we're about to work on an idle for our airship. Let's go ahead and set our translate Y back to 0, and we'll get started on that. So we know that the S key is used to set keyframes. We could also go to the channel itself, right click and choose key selected. So let's go ahead and make sure we do that on frame 1. Another way is to use Shift W and Shift E, and notice that will record translate and rotate keyframes. If we used Shift R, that would set scale keys, but notice our scale channels are gone because, again, we don't need those channels for this control rig. And that is also covered in the rigging section. Alright, so we have some keyframes created for our translate and rotate channels. Let's go ahead and now set our end range for our idle cycle. So we'll go to our end time range here and set that to 61. You can see I'm using an odd number because that gives us a midpoint, which helps us to achieve a seamless cycle. And if you'd like to learn more about seamless cycles, feel free to take a look at our walk cycle series. Alright, so with that said, we'll now want to make sure that our start and end frames are identical. Again, that helps us to achieve a seamless cycle. So on frame 61, I'll go ahead and press Shift W and Shift E. Okay, great. Now when we play back the animation, we'll want to knock off our last frame. The reason why, well, it's really straightforward. It's simply because when we loop back to the beginning of the animation after it plays back, well, our last frame and start frame are the same, so we'll get a 1 frame pause. So again, when we want to view our seamless cycle in the viewport, it's simply just a matter of knocking off the last frame. So we'd view from 1 to 60. Alright, but let's go ahead and add some movement now. We'll go to frame 31, our midpoint, and let's go ahead and lift the ship up. Just slightly. We want this to be subtle since it's an idle. And now we can right click and choose key selected on our translate Y. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look. We'll hit play. Beautiful. So take a look at that. We're getting a really nice start to our idle. But let's say we go in and add a little bit of rotation just so that this doesn't look so robotic. So we'll go to frame 15. We'll go to our rotate Z axis, and let's go ahead and rotate the ship down just slightly. If you like your values to match mine, I'll work with -2 again on 15. We'll right click and choose key selected. Okay, great. So we have a little bit of rotation here. It makes the rotation overall look more natural. So let's go ahead and add the reciprocal on the next segment on frame 45. We'll go ahead and put in a value of +2. Let's go ahead and right click and choose key selected. And let me go ahead and show you what happens if we don't. Right now our value is set to 2, but if we go ahead and move, you'll see that the ship pops back because it's looking at the previous rotation key. So we'll just need to make sure when we set that value of 2 that we lock down that keyframe by right-clicking and choosing key selected. Now it's no longer going to pop. Now if we were to go ahead and knock off our last frame and play back the animation, we will see a pause in the z-axis, and we'll learn why in the next lesson when we clean this up in the graph editor. But for the most part, our idle is looking really nice already, so this is really exciting stuff. Alright, so with that said, we're now ready to learn about the graph editor and how to polish animation with it in the following lesson.